Hi, I'm Nicola, and I'll be talking today about onboarding writers into your organization. I'll describe how writers are often left behind with generic onboarding, the development of the tech writer onboarding classes that we have at Google, and then based on that experience and some of my past experiences, how to develop your own onboarding for writers. So a little bit about me. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and I've been in tech writing over 20 years in a variety of roles and contexts. So I've been the first and only writer at a company. I've worked in large enterprises, working across many teams and product areas. I've helped to onboard acquisition teams and supported tech writers and subject matter experts on tools and doc builds. So I have a lot of different context. So when I am providing guidance in this talk, it's based not only on my current experience developing and leading the tech writer onboarding effort, but also on some of my past experiences. So when I started in January 2019, the orientation, like all orientation, was welcoming, but really overwhelming. There's a lot to take in. It's just like the analogy of trying to drink water from a fire hose. And the orientation at Google for technical roles is very engineering focused. There is some role-specific onboarding, but there's nothing for tech writers. There's role onboarding for engineers, for user experience, for product managers, and a variety of other roles. But writers were left figuring out where they fit in, and the amount of support they had varied depending on the manager you had and their experience and the experience of your team and the resources that were available to you. So this, as I said, is not uncommon. I found that at every company that I've joined, that there wasn't a lot of guidance in terms of your role as a writer. So this is the kind of stuff that tends to be missing from orientation for writers, the role and the responsibilities of the writer. And one of the risks of not making this clear is that in places where doc practices and writer roles are not clearly established, the writer role tends to be narrowly scoped, and you can get pigeonholed into this misconception that all you do is write and that you're basically a copy editor for everybody else. The collaboration models are often, again, very focused on processes where writing and documentation and writers are implicit in the process. And so the documentation life cycle and where it fits in and where writers contribute is unclear or undefined. The stakeholders are important for writers to know in terms of review, approval, input. Again, if those are not available, then writers are left trying to navigate that on their own, and there isn't necessarily as much buy-in to support the writer in getting their work done. And then in terms of career, demonstrating impact, being able to set clear goals for documentation and getting support for those things and recognition. If there isn't a clearly defined writer role and a clearly defined path for opportunities to grow and have impact, again, writers are set up to struggle, possibly fail, or if they feel like their value is going to be more respected somewhere else, they may decide to leave. So a few months in, a few people approached me and said, hey, can you take a look at this information that I've created for new writers? And I took a look and did some digging around and realized we were all reinventing the wheel. Teams were creating onboarding documents and presentations and exercises to fill this gap for writers who were struggling to figure out where they fit in and what their processes were and what their role as a technical writer is at Google. So I went to my manager and said, hey, I think we really need to have some role education that's a part of orientation, and all the other roles are getting it right now. The writers aren't. So he thought it was a great idea. I pulled together some people for this side project. We piloted in May, and it was so successful that we continued to onboard writers as they joined, and we were really well set up for 2020 when we had a large influx of writers and managers come in. So we now have new presence in places like Bangalore and Warsaw, where we have new managers supporting new writers in geographies where there aren't as many experienced people at Google to help them navigate all the processes and resources that we have. So having this education in place was really important for providing everyone with a consistent experience. And then we were able then to focus on streamlining the education that we had and our logistics. So in 2021, the focus has shifted a little because now that we have all these new writers, we've found that other people are starting to notice gaps between the onboarding and ongoing education about process and tools and workflow. So there's an effort going on right now that one of my colleagues is working on to try and catalog and align a lot of this education so that there's not only a more consistent experience when someone joins Google as a writer, but that their ongoing growth as they continue on their journey is available to everyone. So with this background, let's talk a little bit about developing your own onboarding. I like to see onboarding as a map. It highlights the things that are important. It hides the things that aren't important or relevant at this time, and it provides pathways from where you are now to where you want to go. I also think a lot of this education has several values that underscore it and focus it so that it's welcoming. A sense of belonging. You want to make sure that your writer feels like they're valued and that they fit in. You want to provide a sense of community, that they're supported not only when they join and onboard, but as they continue to learn and grow with the company. And then a sense of direction. So again, after you've completed your onboarding, that you have a sense of where you're going to go next and how you can continue to learn and grow your career. So what do you include in your onboarding education? This is going to vary depending on what you have established already, and if you don't have some of these aspects developed, then you may partner with your writer to navigate those and learn about them and develop them together. The what and the who tend to be more tangible. So the what includes documentation input such as design docs and existing documentation or training, marketing material, external sources such as customer forums that will help writers understand context about what users need. And then your documentation deliverables will include the content that the writer owns. Is it just product documentation? Does it include outreach such as blog posts? Does it include videos, for example? It's important to set those boundaries so that writers aren't trying to field random requests to edit slides or create videos. Setting those priorities and setting boundaries is important. The who is everyone involved in the full doc lifecycle. So that includes, of course, users and understanding whether they're internal or external or both. What industry they might be in, what problems they're trying to solve, and so on. The stakeholders are those involved in planning and developing and delivering the documentation. So information sources in engineering and product management, marketing, support, and so on. And then anyone involved in reviewing plans or reviewing documentation and providing approvals. I wanted to mention leadership here because where a writer reports into can impact what they work on in their scope. So if a writer's reporting into marketing or if they're reporting into engineering, that can make the scope of what they work on a little different. And if they're not reporting into a manager who's familiar with documentation practices, again, there may need to be some partnership around defining roles and responsibilities and practices. So speaking of practices, the how is your documentation life cycle and defining some of those milestones, like planning for the documentation, and then the writer's role in your overall project life cycle, like involving writers in design doc reviews and UI reviews, making sure that there are milestones for reviewing documentation, making sure that those things are integrated with your dashboards and progress on projects and ownership of completion of projects. It can also include tools and understanding whether or not you have documentation integrated with your development processes. Is there a Docs code model where you're using a similar tool workflow, or are things separated? Do you have continuous releases, or do you have multiple versions that you need to maintain? So these are all questions around process and logistics that can help writers understand where they fit in, and also help the team understand the writer's contributions beyond just writing documentation. The career information includes defining the role, but also just helping writers understand what the overall expectations are in terms of their contributions. So that can include working across teams, that can include work community outreach or mentoring at more senior levels. And what are the opportunities for training and growth? What are the expectations for performance if you want to move upwards? What are the opportunities to move laterally? These all help a writer understand how their career will develop with your organization. I have more details in an onboarding toolkit on GitHub at github/google/opendocs/onboarding, and there are some links to some additional resources and examples. So I mentioned earlier that you may not have everything established, and that's okay. So this diagram comes from a Google report on training site reliability engineers. And what I like about it is that similar to documentation practices, site reliability engineering practices may not be established in an organization. And so in smaller organizations, you'll need to make some effort to work and partner together to learn about what those practices are and gradually develop them and implement them in your organization. And then in larger companies, there is more of a need to provide a culture shift. So if you've got just one writer coming in, then some of that may be working with leadership in your company to start to change mindset. And if you have multiple writers coming in, then there may be some effort to educate them in some practices and have them work together to develop practices so they can go to their respective stakeholders and start establishing new relationships, new processes that are consistent across the company. If your organization has more established documentation practices, then you'll be focusing more on taking those practices and helping to onboard your writers and provide ongoing learning. In smaller companies, you'll focus more on that initial onboarding experience, and then you may develop things as you grow and as the writer starts to learn. The orientation program that's mentioned here for smaller companies with more people coming in is again to provide that consistent experience. And then in larger companies, you'll find that if you have a smaller number of people coming in, which was more of the case when I started, that there is more of a shadowing and ongoing learning within individual teams. But now that we have a large number of new writers to support, we are shifting more towards cataloging and aligning our education so that we can provide a more consistent experience, not just in the onboarding, but in the ongoing learning. So now that you have a sense of what content to include and where you want to go with it, you can now establish some goals for that initial learning experience. So in terms of your onboarding goals, a really concrete way to set those up is to use the sentence, a writer should be able to, and then identify some very concrete tasks that the writer should be able to accomplish when the onboarding is done. So I have a few examples here. For example, being able to identify all your stakeholders, identifying your users and what their needs are, and then maybe some pieces from your authoring workflow, so identifying a bug, making a change, getting that reviewed, getting it published. Once you have your goals, then you can actually put your content together. And I'm going to go over quickly what we have put together, but want to emphasize also that this is going to look very different in your situation, for your context, for the writer role that you have, and where you are in your doc practices, how much staffing you have to support them, and so on. I want to make that very clear, but this is what we have. So our focus, because we are supporting a wide range of people coming in and who are going into different teams with different processes and even different audiences, we're focusing on, at a high level, role education and tools and workflow education that applies to most writers at Google. We have 2 60-minute classes. They've always been virtual, and they're done live because, again, we have the staffing to do that. We have slides with highlights and then more details and links and the speaker notes that we distribute afterwards. And then we provide anonymous surveys so that we can use the feedback for ongoing improvements. The role education, a lot of this should look familiar. The types of docs we have, style guides, scope of responsibilities, and so on. Relationships, again, users and stakeholders, and we also talk about then how those are connected in terms of culture and collaboration at Google. In terms of career, again, we talk about performance expectations, how to demonstrate your impact. What I have found, not only at Google, but at other companies, is that when you are looking at performance evaluation and you want to go and write up the impact that you have, any examples that you have internally are generally geared towards the more common roles in the organization, like engineering or sales. So having some really good examples for writers can help them to be more successful and advocate for themselves at performance time. The workflow education is more hands-on, so we choose a simple, happy path to take writers through the tools, and the focus is on just getting your hands on the tools, getting an understanding of how they work and how the doc lifecycle works. So we have a very simple markdown file that's just a list of books and songs. Writers look at the bug and they find the file, they go and edit it, and then they get it reviewed and published. It's all done in a sandbox area so that there's no impact on any team or production work. Once all this is done, then it's time to go on from onboarding to your specific teams. In Google Cloud, we have a checklist, a very big checklist, and it's divided up by first week, first month, first 3 months, so that you can track your progress. We have a chat room for all new writers so that it's a safe space for asking any kind of question. And there are many, many mailing lists so that writers can connect with more specific communities like internal writers or writers with a developer audience, for example. And then individual teams provide more specific onboarding for their products, for their teams, for their specific tooling, if it's different than what we provide. And then one of the things I wanted to highlight is the use of a friction log. So this is a lightweight tool for communicating feedback about a process you're trying to learn about. And it's used not just for onboarding, but anytime you are trying something new and want to document what went well and what didn't. So writers use it, engineers, product managers, anybody who's trying to work through something. So this is a very simple example of a part of a friction log. You take a task that you've been assigned or that you want to learn about, and you create a Google Doc and you write about the process as if you're talking out loud. You then highlight using color or codes the things that went well or the things that didn't. So green indicates, yeah, this was great, this worked really well. Amber is, this was really annoying, but I got through it or I got some help. And red is, I would blocked, or I would just totally quit trying to do this if this wasn't my job. The friction logs are really useful because it's lightweight, it's easy to put together. People can come in and comment, and there can be some discussion with whoever's responsible for the product or process. You can open up bugs and assign action items from the Google Doc. And that way you're improving the experience for the next person who might be trying this. Or if this is for a product that goes out to customers, you're also improving the user experience. The last thing I want to talk about is increasing the visibility of documentation and writers in your organization. So I talked earlier about organizations where doc practices are not well established and that you may need to do some nudging towards culture change. So these are some ideas around helping to make that change happen. Including the writer role in your team processes helps to establish for the whole team that the writer is contributing more than just writing some documentation. For example, you want to make sure that they are included in reviews like UI reviews or error message reviews or design doc reviews. And as a stakeholder in any change that affects users, they can contribute to product quality. Similarly, identifying stakeholders who have accountability for doing reviews and approvals for documentation plans and documentation you are delivering also helps to establish that you value those contributions. Established ownership, shared ownership of documentation work. What I mean by that is that a writer is not the sole person responsible for making sure documentation is delivered. There are people and documents that will feed into creation of the documentation. And so making sure that as you plan work, that the impacts on documentation are included, and that completion of a feature, for example, also includes making sure that you plan for the completion of the documentation. Recognizing work on the writer's side includes looking at those contributions that go beyond writing. So saying, thank you for working across 3 teams to make sure that the 3 components we work on integrate really well. You've identified new use cases we haven't thought of, and our teams are now collaborating better than they were ever before. Recognizing contributions from subject matter experts, saying thank you for your contributions to the documentation, helps to send the message that these contributions are valuable and that documentation is a valuable part of the work that everyone does. Including templates and writing guidance for everyone. Here I mean that having templates and writing guidance, not just for documentation, but for things like design docs or presentation templates. These things help to, again, reinforce that having a consistent quality set of internal docs even will allow people to collaborate more effectively. And this feeds into my next point, which is about learning culture. So the DevOps Research and Assessment Organization, DORA for short, They do rigorous research around organizational performance. And in 2014, their State of DevOps report found that organizations that invest in learning culture, meaning investing in training, encouraging knowledge sharing, and making it safe to fail and learn from those experiences, those organizations saw productivity gains, including reduced lead time to changes, faster recovery from failure, and strong team culture. Similarly, in 2019, they found that organizations that invest in searchable information ecosystems, so making it easy to find code and documentation internally, that resulted in people reporting 1.73 times more that they felt more productive when they were able to use internal search to find what they needed. For external search, the number was 1.67 times more likely to feel productive. And in this case, this speaks not only to being able to find the information you need for your work, but also growing your user base externally, and as a side effect, improving recruitment. Both the learning culture and the search findings speak to aspects of documentation that feed this virtuous cycle of learning within a team. So when you have successful learning culture and you have successful search, people want to continue to contribute to that. And it creates a more productive team with a stronger culture. I want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who's contributed to making onboarding of new writers successful. That includes everyone who's helped to create materials or teach the onboarding classes, and it also includes Googlers who have taken to joining the chat room where we have a lot of new writers asking questions, and also those who perform mentoring either formally or informally. I get to present to you myself, but this is very much a group effort. And thank you for taking the time to watch and for taking an interest in helping new writers.
I'll start with, I know that you answered a lot of these questions. You were super responsive. You weren't afraid of seeing your own face, which was, I don't know, I think kind of rare. But for the benefit of people maybe watching this on YouTube later, Sarah was wondering, what does career progression look like at Google? Is it captured in title changes mostly, or maybe in some other way?
I mean, there are different titles, but in practice, I mean, not everybody will advertise a different title, like in the internal directory. A lot of people, even as they progress, will just distill on their internal profile, have tech writer. It's not really about that. And even in terms of your level, you can decide that you want to hide what level you're at. So it's kind of less about that. It's much more about the scope of your impact. So are you just working on like a little feature of your product and you're taking a lot of guidance from other writers, from your manager, from your team lead, and sort of having your hand held a little more? Are you taking much more of a leadership role, setting direction, having influence over the product? That's more what the progression looks like. And not just at Google, but even like when I was working at IBM, it was very similar. It's much more about the scope that you have and the impact that you have, and leadership skills and collaboration skills, and showing that you have impact beyond this, a little small, very narrowly scoped field.
Very cool. So questions, as she mentioned, and we have quite a few questions in this very similar vein. The first one is from Christy. Christy had asked, and maybe you had addressed some of this in the chat, Nicola, if you have any advice for smaller companies that may be onboarding. She says, it feels like for smaller companies, you sometimes get thrown right into the fire, but expectation setting is awesome, especially at the beginning of a career at a company.
Yeah, so I mean, looking back, I didn't do this earlier in my career, and that's when I worked with some of the smaller companies. But I mean, looking back, I would even probably start some of that conversation in the interview. And I know if you pass that, the opportunity is gone. But I think really when you don't have it, and I talked about it a little bit in the talk, it's going to be, don't try to like boil the ocean. And I think some of this kind of came across in one of the earlier talks. You're trying to change everything is going to be a Herculean effort. What you really want to do is try to find small wins, find allies, look for opportunities to have small impacts, and then demonstrate that you've made a difference, and help, work with your manager, particularly if they're not familiar with writing, to even just educate them and say, here's what, here's some information about how GitLab frames the responsibilities of a technical writer. This isn't necessarily where we are today, but this is the kind of scope that I have, and you can see a lot of these responsibilities aren't just sitting here and doing copywriting, that they involve collaboration, and they involve research, and they involve providing feedback early in the development process. So kind of using that model and leveraging that and having conversations around that, I think might help.
Thank you. It is somewhat similar to what Christy asked, but I'll go ahead and mention if you had any advice or onboarding at organizations that are relatively mature according to whatever measurement, but whose integration is actually very immature by all of our measurements here in our community. So that was a question that I typed, asking for a friend, which is myself. And maybe a lot to address, and I'm going to actually skip ahead to a question from Mike, because quite concisely. He asked here in this session chat, for people who become first writers, how would you modify your onboarding template?
So again, I was trying to distinguish in the talk between, you already have things that are established, and more. We had some earlier talks in this conference about this sort of growth model that it's going to develop organically, and I really feel the same way about trying to define that role for yourself as the first writer. Is again, you might have some discussions around where you want to go, but this is what we have now. This is the set of documentation we have now. These are the kinds of things we produce. This is where we would like to be, and what are some small wins we can get between now and then. And then in terms of your role setting boundaries, like saying things like, I'm not here to edit everyone's PowerPoints, but I do have skills to help all of us work together to produce better content for our customers, so I can maybe help write a template, and then you don't have to have people come and ask me to do work, and I'm not spending my time just doing some copy editing when I can provide better value. I would take much more of that approach, is looking for small wins. And then in terms of the question about a large organization, again, like, one of the ways I would do it is find, if you have a team or if you have a set of stakeholders where you can run a very sort of small proof of concept of how working differently would work well, then word of mouth can get around that you were doing that. So just completely random example. So when I was at IBM, everybody was there was a centralized way to, there was a centralized set of doc tools. But in terms of build processes, it was very much left up to each product organization. And so some teams had a centralized doc team that managed things. Some people were very much on their own, and each writer had to figure out, sometimes you were the only writer on your product team, how you were going to build your content. And at one point I worked with an acquisition, and they were using Hudson to build their docs. I hadn't really worked with that deeply before, and when I saw that, I was like, why aren't a bunch of other teams doing this? Because it's very much self-serve. It's got a UI, SMEs can use it. And I put that together, and very much grassroots, similar to this onboarding stuff, I started evangelizing that, and it became a word of mouth thing. So it was proof of concept. It was, look, I'm doing this. It's making a difference. I have engagement. from both SMEs and writers in this process. And I've documented how I did it. So now I have a template for you that you can go off and do, and you don't have to figure it out yourself. That's the approach that I took for that's the approach I generally take for doing things like that. I tend to kind of document everything I do. And that way, I can just hand it over to the next person, because I've changed jobs enough times that I've gone through the process of, can you please dump your brain before you leave? So it's very much a habit I have.
Makes sense, for sure. Sarah asked a follow-up question from earlier about what career progression looks like at Google. Says, I guess I should have asked about recognition of career progression. So how are writers rewarded for growing their impact and role?
I mean, that is going to vary by company. If you're talking specifically about compensation, I probably want a little bit of clarity about rewarding. I guess if you're looking at promotion, again, there will be a place like Google and at IBM, there will be set criteria around what's expected at each job level. And then generally what happens is you are expected to be demonstrating that you are performing at that next level already. It's not like, oh, you have some potential to get there. It's more, these are the expectations for you to get promoted. And you have demonstrated that you are already working at that level. And so you have evidence to back that up, and reviews from your peers to say, hey, you know, this person really is working at that level because they have this catalog of criteria that they can look against for what the expectations of the writer are. And the promotion happens based on evaluation against that criteria.
Yeah, thanks. We also had a question from Christina wondering about how many people worked on that onboarding experience that you took us through.
Yeah, so it was my brainchild to kind of create it as a general course for orientation, but it basically, I recruited one person who came to me with slides and said, hey, can I show you these slides? It has all the things I wish people had told me. And someone else said they'd written up something for writers, and I looked at that. So it kind of grew organically. So it started with me and 3 other people. We put the content together, and we were teaching everybody that was coming in. And then by the end of 2019, we said we need more people, and we started recruiting more. But it started with 4 initially.
Pivoting direction here a little bit, there's a question from Faith. It looks like you referenced a first group in your presentation. Whether there were any processes that you adopted with the first group but quickly dropped because perhaps of overheads or inefficiency issues?
Yeah, I saw that, and I wasn't sure what the difference was between first group and second group. I'm wondering if that references the and
cohorts, maybe?
Sorry?
Oh, sorry. Cohorts or
the material for the classes. I'm sorry. Like to look at the chat, I have to like zoom right in because I don't see well. Okay, we can look at a few dimensions. If we're talking about the classes, and that they are for some different groups of people, the role onboarding class is specifically for people who are new to Google and need to understand the context of Google and working as a writer at Google. The tool education. So what we found is there are people like product managers who contribute to the documentation sometimes, but it's very occasional. And they need to have an understanding of how the tools work as well. And they don't get that either really as a part of their education when they come in. So we found that the tool education applies to a much wider spectrum of people than just the writers. So I don't know if the question was around that or whether it was around sort of young organizations that don't have mature processes versus more mature ones. But I don't really see how that question would apply. Wasn't sure.
Great. So I think we are getting close to our allotted time. So this way we can give people a little bit of time to hang out in the hop-in platform before it closes down, and take a look at the resources posted in the chat and look at links and maybe say hi in the conference sessions. So yeah, thank you so much, Nicola. Thank you for taking us through and demystifying what information you need at a new job. I know that it often feels like drinking from the fire hose to begin with, but the way that you broke that down and just kind of took us through what each step meant, I think people will find it really helpful. We have people at all levels watching, and I think it's going to help at each one. So thank you.
Thanks.